Okay, more great stuff. Can I get you all to get back in your seats? And we're going to welcome Nelda Matheny. She's going to bring some great information about using recycled water to irrigate Bay Area landscapes. So these are the kind of tools that we need now. Of course, that even if we're not in a drought, it's a good way for us to start looking at our resources in a different way. So she's rapidly making her way to the front here. So let's welcome Nelda Matheny.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Lovely to be here with you all today. A handout is coming around. It's 2 pages. Sorry, I didn't get it stapled together. And it has a little bit more detail about some of the things that I'm going to talk about today regarding recycled water. And it's essentially summary parts taken out from a book that Larry and I are working on. Actually, it'll be out soon on managing landscapes irrigated with recycled water. So I have a half an hour to condense that 150-page book for you. And let's get going then. Okay, what am I pushing here? That's not working. That works. Okay, so recycled water has come to the Bay Area. And it's going to be, the use is going to be expanding incredibly in the next 10 to 20 years. This graphic shows cities that currently have recycled water available for at least part of the landscapes in the city, and those that are planned. The governor's water conservation bill has provided billions of dollars, and a lot of that is going to go to recycled water. And my experience is that the money that's spent on bringing recycled water to communities is spent on the public process, the engineering, and the installation of the pipe. And I hope one of your take-home messages today is we need some of that money to figure out how to put it on landscapes, okay? Because it's can increase costs, and so we need some help in that regard. So people are usually have feelings of fear and trepidation when I talk about recycled water, because it's a new thing and we've all heard stories of when it didn't work so well. And the things we mostly fear, I think, are that there's going to be damage to the landscape, to the soils, and to the plants in the landscape. Everything's going to be ugly and die. And I want to reassure you that does not have to happen. And I want to help you understand how that's not going to happen and what to do about it. This is something we need to embrace. This is something we're either going to be using recycled water or we're not going to use any water at all on our landscapes. So let's learn how to do it. Okay? First, I need a very brief science lesson. This is a kind of complicated technical situation with recycled water, so we just need to understand some basics. First of all, how does the salt get in there? Well, if we irrigate with water that has salt in it, that water, along with the salts, goes into the soil, and then the plant absorbs the water with its salt into the plant, and then when the water vapor is transpired out of the plant, the salts stay in the plant. So that fundamentally is the cycle that can result in plant damage. And so we need to figure out how to do something in that process to keep those salts from becoming so concentrated that we have damage or injury. Now, this process of accumulation of salts in the soil, uptake and accumulate in the plant, takes a long time. It takes, in my experience, it takes 4 to 5 years from beginning use of a high salt recycled water until we see sensitive plants damaged. So if you change to recycled water and in a couple months you're having plant problems, please do not blame it on the water. Okay, it takes a while. So we have time to implement the term we use now is adaptive management to mitigate that, the effects of the water. And the process I'm going to talk about today is to help understand what you need to mitigate, how to go about doing it, and what are the tools in our toolbox to adapt to a different kind of water. So here's another big concept, is that the concentration of the salts depends on the volume of water they're in. So imagine taking this tablespoon of the spoon of salt and mixing it in this full glass of water. We have an X concentration, a 1X concentration of salt in that water. If we put that same amount of salt in half a glass of water, the concentration of the salt in that water is twice as much as it is in the full glass. You get that? Here's why that's important. In soils, we have these particles, and then in the pores is water, right? This is saturated. The soil is saturated with water, meaning all the pores are full of water. When the soil dries down, either from evaporation or the plant's pulling the water out of it, then air comes in those pores, and you have thinner films of water around those particles. So if you have less water and you have the same amount of salt, what does that mean? This is saltier than this. And all we've done is change the moisture content of the soil. As the soil dries down, the concentration of the salt increases, and you get more likelihood of damaging plants. So this leads to a management technique, which is keep the soil a little wetter. Don't let it get too dry if you're using a higher salt water. Another way to increase salts is in the plant itself, is if the leaf has less moisture in it. So if the plant is located in a high reflected heat, high exposed situation, you're going to get more water leaving that foliage, and so the salts get more concentrated in there because there's less water in the tissue itself, compared to the same plant growing in a shady, non-reflected heat situation. So here we have the same plant growing on the same site, irrigated with the same water, but the exposure here is different, and so we have a different response to the salts. Okay? Another really important one for us all to realize right now particularly is that water deficit and salt damage look pretty much the same. So here we have 3 redwoods. One of them, the damage you see is due to high salt in a recycled water. Which one do you think it is? Door A, door B, or door C? Okay, we have unanimity here. It is A. This one's recycled water. This one is sudden exposure to hot, dry winds. This one is lack of water. So it just haven't been irrigated at all. All right? Looks all the same, right? Oops. Okay. Let's look at the tissue itself. This foliage looks pretty similar to this foliage. Notice the brown tips. And this one is a normal plant. That's what redwood ought to look like. Here's the foliage analysis for sodium and chloride, 0.77 and 1600. Okay? The one on the left has a whole lot more sodium and chloride than normal. The one on the right actually has less sodium and chloride than normal. This one is a salt toxicity. This one is a water deficit. So you can't really tell the difference based on symptoms, whether you've got a salt problem or a water deficit problem. The only way we can really tell is by doing tissue analyses. I see people making a lot of assumptions out in the landscape about, the redwoods are dying because such and such is damaged, because you really need to back this up with some good data to understand if your diagnosis is correct or not. Okay, here's another basic science thing, is soil salinity is measured in by electrical conductivity. Excuse me. So a water that has more salt than another is going to conduct electricity better. So it's going to have a higher number in terms of the electrical conductivity. To measure soil salinity, what we do is we get the soil saturated, put that sample under a vacuum to pull all the water out of it, and then measure that, so the salinity in that water. That's called the salinity of the soil extract. And that is expressed as EC with a sub little e. A water salinity is done directly with water. You just take the hose and fill a container, and you put your device in there, and it tells you what the ECW is. So if you see values of EC, if it's an E sub E, that means it's coming from soil. If it's a sub W, that means it's coming from water. This is important because how we interpret those numbers is very different if it's from a soil or a water. To further complicate things, water people like to talk about TDS, total dissolved water, total dissolved solids in the water. And horticulturists like to talk about electrical conductivity. So you need to be able to talk both languages. And 1 EC is about equal to 240 TDS. I bring this up because when you look at reports, you're going to wonder, what the heck are these values? Okay, specific ions are very important. So what a salt is it's a compound that when it's added to water, the two ions separate out. So like sodium chloride. They're together in our salt shaker. You put them in water and they dissolve, meaning they come apart. So those two parts are called ions because they have a charge. So the specific ions we're interested in are chloride, sodium, and boron. These are the ones that affect plants the most. So we need to know about those. Another important component is bicarbonate. Bicarbonate is what makes the white spotting on cars and windows and your glasses in your dishwasher. So that's a bicarbonate ion that's combining with a calcium or something else. And it's important in recycled water because, one, it makes things like statues look bad. But once it makes this precipitate, the powder, that gets in our valves and in our emitters, and it wears out the irrigation equipment more quickly. So we need to know how much bicarbonate's in the water too. Okay, so here we have a beautiful landscape that is we're going to bring recycled water into it. How are we going to know what's going to happen and what we need to do to adapt to that? Well, there are four components that we need to look at. First is, what is the water quality? What are the site conditions? Third is irrigation, and fourth is, what is the plant salt tolerance? So when you hear that, you're going to have to put recycled water on your parks or on your golf course or on your medians. How that landscape responds isn't solely dependent on the water itself, the fact that you're getting recycled water. it depends on these 4 factors. And I think it's very important that we understand what those are so we can make intelligent decisions. So let's look first at water quality. All recycled waters are not equal. The quality of water depends on what the original source of water was, like Hetch Hetchy or wells. What's added during use. So if people are using water softeners, or if there's seawater intrusion into the sewer system, and then what treatments are applied to clean it up. Now this table represents the water quality information for recycled waters available in the Bay Area right now. So this shows the annual average for pH, for electrical conductivity, sodium, and so forth. So you see, for instance, in sodium, we have a range of 75 to 211. Well, I want the 75. I don't know about you, but I don't want that 211 stuff. So I want you to see what a range there is. There's a big difference between the water that's supplied in Santa Rosa, the recycled water in Santa Rosa, and the recycled water at East Bay Mud. So when Larry and I were trying to get a handle on how to interpret all this data, what we thought we'd do is try to group categories that we could then evaluate for what effects it might have on plants. And so we came up with these 4 categories, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then we defined these thresholds, these ranges for the important water quality components. And you can think of these as representing good, fair, moderate, and poor water, all right? So again, we would all like the good, wouldn't we? Unfortunately, some of us get this one, Oakland being one of them. And if we look at where these waters are distributed in the Bay Area, we see that Santa Rosa is really the only recycled water in the Bay Area that's category 1 that I know of. There may be others, I don't know. Category 2's in Dublin, Livermore, and in San Jose. San Jose is actually very close to a category 1 because it's now blending its water with reverse osmosis water. What puts it into a category 2 is the chlorides are still a little too high. You will notice that we don't have any 4s. So we don't have any what we would rate as poor water quality for recycled water in the Bay Area. I think it's important for us all to appreciate that because we could have way worse water. Also, many of these agencies are working hard to improve their water quality. They want to get to a category 1, or if there are 3, they want to get to a category 2 because it means greater acceptance by us for using that water. The second part, so that was the water quality part. The second part is plant salt tolerance, and there's a huge range in that. So in any one landscape, you're going to have some low, moderate, and high salt tolerance. As an example of the low, here's a sweet gum. This is showing chloride toxicity around the foliage. Here's a purple leaf plum at moderate, and you can see some tip burn here. Now notice you don't see that very readily because of the color of the foliage. So one of your questions to ask yourself and your constituents is, what's acceptable? What appearance is okay in order for us to use a recycled water that's available? And then high, this is Coast Live Oak, that's high. So when I look at landscapes around the Bay Area and do the inventories, I find that generally most of the plants are in the moderate to high categories, and relatively small proportion, usually less than 20%, is salt sensitive. The third component is the site. So we're interested in the texture of the soil, what its current salinity and pH is, and whether it drains. And we're also interested in what kind of exposure is at that site. Is it surrounded by pavement, so we have a lot of evaporative pressure, that we have higher temperatures, is it exposed to windy conditions, and so forth. The fourth component is the irrigation system. So how is the water delivered? One of the interesting things about water that has salt in it is that if you spray that on the foliage, you're going to get damage way sooner than if those salts are taken up through the root system. So I said earlier, you know, I usually see there's 4 to 5 years before I see any damage on plants. But if you spray a high chloride water on a sensitive plant on a 102-degree day, you're going to get damage that day. So that's spraying it directly on the foliage is different than applying it to the soil. All right, so those are the basics of the science and then the factors we need to consider. So how do we use that information when we're going to bring water, recycle water into an established landscape? The first thing we need to do is to learn about the site. What's there in terms of the soil? What's there in terms of the plants? We'll do an inventory of all the plants and rank them in their salt tolerance. We need to know then how saline can we let the soil get before we're going to cause too much damage. So we would decide what is our salinity threshold from the soil. Adjust our maintenance practices to try to maintain that soil salinity below the threshold and monitor the plants. Probably the most important thing to do, and the thing that doesn't usually get done because it's time and money intensive, is to fix whatever problems are existing. And probably the most important is the irrigation system. These sites are usually older. They've had, you know, if their irrigation system's been in 10, 20 years, there are going to be problems with that. And one of the things about using more saline water for irrigation is you don't have tolerance to problems. Any problems you have are only going to get worse. So getting the irrigation system up to snuff is a very important part of getting a landscape ready for recycled water. Again, this is deodar cedar. You can see where the impact heads hit from here to here. They're not hitting up here. So that's showing you the foliage, the increased damage caused when saline water is put on foliage. And we want to make sure the site drains because leaching treatments are our most important management technique. I'll talk a little bit more on that in a second. Was that your question?
No, I was just saying, I see herbicides that don't do that kind of damage to trees. Why are we putting that stuff out in our parks?
Well, because it's mandated.
Warm and fuzzy.
Well, you know, most people are going to get better water quality than what was used on that site.
I used the Livermore water.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You had that as a number 2.
Yes.
And it was that.
It was doing that. Yeah, it's really one of the most important retrofits to do is to get low profile spray if you're using spray and not wet the foliage.
But not wet the foliage. How do you water?
Well,
Not wet the foliage.
some things are not going to make it. Some things you're going to have to replace. You know, if it can't take it, well, get it out and put something in that will. Okay. When designing new landscapes, we have a little better control over some of the variables because, first of all, we can pick plants that are salt tolerant. Now, we don't always know exactly what those are because there's not a whole lot of information, either research-based or not, about what plants tolerate which categories of water and so forth. In our book and on your handout, we have some guidelines for some of our observations. So the last page of your handout has a list of plants. That's just a short list. I think we have about 600 species in our data set now. But it is important to pick plants that are going to take the water, to evaluate what the soil is, and fix drainage problems if they're there. Now, irrigation systems also need a different approach. There are specific kinds of equipment that are now being manufactured for recycled water, or it's also called dirty water sometimes. There are very strict requirements for irrigation systems, what the water can hit, what the equipment needs to do, the specific piping that you use, and so forth. Every site that is using recycled water must have a site supervisor. That site supervisor has to go to site supervisor training, which is provided by the recycled water retailer. And so there are very important laws and regulations that have to be followed that don't have anything to do about landscape quality, but have to do about human safety. They don't want to mix the recycled water with people, okay? So our most important management technique is to try to manage how much salt accumulates in the root zone. And we do that through leaching. So leaching is if we apply this much water, if we water to this depth, say this is, I don't know, 1.5 feet or whatever you usually water to, depending on what the plants are, you're going to get salt accumulating in that zone. So to leach, you apply a whole bunch more water, and that moves many of the salts down below the root zone. So we're trying to push those salts deeper. Okay? To do that, we have to have drainage. So many of our urban soils do not drain very well, and they often have barriers to drainage. So one of the most expensive parts of getting a landscape ready for recycled water is dealing with the drainage issues. We need to be able to move water from here down below. If there's a barrier, we need to get through the barrier. And that's usually done with trenching or something like that. If there's no permeable soil below, then we need to put in drainage system, which is quite expensive. Then I mentioned the importance of keeping the salts diluted. So we also want to use more water. Redwood City provides a water budget for their commercial clients. It's accessible online. They can compare what their budget is and where they are in their budget. They have increased that budget 20 to 25% for recycled water users because they need to use more water than with potable water to both keep the soil moisture and to leach the salts. So here's an example of a redwood tree in very dry soil, about 30 feet away, a redwood tree in moist soil, and you can see the difference in the trees. Those are on recycled water. One of the good things about recycled water is that there are nutrients in it. And so every time you irrigate, you're adding some fertilizer. And I think that probably for most shrubs and trees, you won't need to fertilizer anymore. You'll still need some fertilizer for turf and annuals and ground cover kind of things. But you could probably cut the fertilizer in half. So that would be a savings there. Because of the changes that occur in the soil, in the plants, it's important to monitor regularly. And that monitoring involves looking at how the plants are doing, what the pests are doing, and then actually collecting soil samples to measure what the pH and the salinity is in the soil. So when managing landscapes, we have a bag of tools to use. And in most cases, they're things that we're familiar with. It just needs to have more attention. We need a more technical approach. And that is kind of the science part I was talking about in the beginning. We need to maintain the soil moisture. We need to avoid wetting the foliage. We need to leach. Sometimes we might need to add gypsum if the sodium increases in the soil. Gypsum, I think everybody's probably familiar with in the maintenance world. Decrease the fertilizer application, monitor the soil and plants, and plan for repairing and replacing irrigation components on a more frequent basis. So those are the kind of the management challenges and opportunities we face. Now, I think we need to embrace this change, and we need to learn how to make it work, because I don't think it's the responsible thing to do, I mean, quite frankly. And we're going to be required for it. So before too long, we will irrigate with recycled water or no water. And so we need to learn how to use it. Not all recycled water has high salts. We need to understand what is the quality of the water that's coming to my properties, to my town. And I know it can be very confusing looking at lab reports and water analyses. I'm happy to help you wade through that if you would like that. Please use me as a resource. Most drought-tolerant plants have moderate to high salt tolerance. So if we aim for a water-conserving landscape, we're going to also get some salt tolerance along with it. So I think it's a win-win looking at our plant palettes and really what's appropriate to grow in this climate. If we plant something that's evolved in an environment where there are salts in the landscape, they're going to be more salt tolerant. And those are the landscapes that are Mediterranean in climate, that are desert in climate. And those are the things we need to incorporate in our landscapes. That is the sum of my presentation for you. I think we're waiting until later to have questions, right, Nancy? All right. It's been a pleasure talking with you.